Uh, we live in interesting times, do we not? And what's happening today in the world, and the crises that the world is facing, in a certain sense, has been long predicted would happen at this time in human history. And the reason for that is twofold, really, because the crisis that humanity is facing collectively today is a crisis that has to do with two energetic phenomena that are happening at this time in history. One is an astrological phenomena, and the other is a rheological phenomena. The astrological phenomena is what you're all familiar with. We're moving from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And it's not like one day Pisces ends and the next day Aquarius begins. No, there's a huge overlap between the two. And people speculate on how big that overlap is, but a lot of people put it as much as like 200 years. Um, but many people kind of agree, and I do, that it looks like that we're probably about at the midway point of that overlap, where they're about getting close to being even. What we're saying is these two energies, the energy of Pisces and the energy of Aquarius, both are conditioning the mental plane, but they're so different in their conditioning. And that leads people on this planet to inwardly find identification with one energetic pattern over the other. So we've got this interfacing going on, and that's really, really a big part of the crisis because what happens is with that duality comes greater polarizations and less common ground. And I don't know about you, but as I look out at the world and what you see going on, common ground, you never hear that anymore. It's everything's extreme. Okay. So that's part of it, this astrological change. There's another part that is rheological. We're moving from a sixth ray age to a seventh ray age. And that too has an overlap. The sixth ray is called the ray of idealism and devotion, and it's been the conditioning ray for 2,100 years. It's been the dominant ray. You know, the rays are interesting because it's not like the seven rays are always in equal proportion and expression. They're not. They're at different intensities at different periods of time, and there's always one ray that is sort of the dominant energy for a period of time. And that's what we're talking about here. We're moving from the sixth ray dominance to the seventh. And the sixth ray was emphasizing devotion and emphasizing the notion that if you want to find God, if you want to find the spiritual path, it's found through a perception and a driving force to the ideals you espouse. In other words, to a sixth ray person, ideals are divine and are gateways to divinity. And essentially that's true. It's just that it's not the only gateway. But a lot of times it tends to think it's the only gateway. Whereas the seventh ray is much more about trying to ground spirituality, whereas the sixth ray, it kept it more on a feeling nature rather than a practical nature. And that's the sixth ray. But the seventh ray is trying to ground it more and has far more mind in the equation of the search for spiritual life as opposed to the sixth ray. The sixth ray is filled with heart, filled with compassion, filled with the Christ energy, but had kind of a disregard for or distrust of mind. Even the early church didn't want their parishioners to read the Bible. They felt that only the priests had the authority to read the Bible. Um, whereas the seventh ray says, no, the mind is as sacred as the heart, and that we not only have to utilize the mind in unison with the heart, but we also want to ground it, make it real. So we're moving from an era of mystical tendency, which is sixth ray, into the era of practical mysticism, which is seventh ray. And that too is an overlap. And that too is causing tremendous problems in the world today, tremendous problems. And it's based on the same notion, friends. It's based on the same notion that it's creating more polarization. So we have some people identifying with the old pattern and some people identifying with the new. And uh, the battle goes on. The battle goes on. And what that battle is so interesting to think about because it triggers what we call the period of the burning ground. And we are now in the period of the burning ground. What do we mean by that? Well, we're in a cycle now, a period where humanity is um, being tested, being tested, and that um, the Tibetan tells us that, I'm going to paraphrase, but something to the effect of crisis is the prelude to all initiations. Crisis is the prelude to all significant expansions of consciousness. And I know that can be disturbing to people. Why does crisis have to be so part of this? And the answer is because we're the fourth kingdom of nature. So let's understand that the whole human kingdom, it has a soul, the soul of humanity. And the soul of humanity is a fourth ray soul. Why? Because we're the fourth kingdom. First is mineral, then plant, animal, human, fourth. Then there's three above us, five, six, and seven. And so the fourth kingdom is primarily governed by the fourth ray. And the fourth ray is called the ray of harmony through conflict. It's not called the ray of harmony and conflict. It's harmony through conflict. It's in the human kingdom and only in the human kingdom where a battle goes on as a function of expanding to a higher order. And so, in a certain sense, conflict for us is actually part of the equation of growth. Now, there's physical conflict, war, and so forth, but there's conflict of mental ideations, conflict, emotional conflict. But the day will come, we are told by the Tibetan, the day will come when eventually conflict that is predictable will not hit the ground and will not be physical. It'll stay on the mental plane, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet. We probably have a few hundred years to go before that emerges. But the point is that this is so predictable as we move into these new ages that we would be more likely to go into conflict. For instance, let me give you an example of what I mean by this fourth ray conflict in all of us. So it's not just the soul of humanity. Your soul, your causal body is energetically intimately related to the soul of humanity. So, um, let's look at it this way. You have each of us have hundreds of lives where the whole purpose is to develop the lower self, develop the personality. The soul is in the game, but it's behind the scenes and you're unconscious of it. But eventually, the personality gets built enough that the soul can make a more deliberate attempt at communicating with that personality and trying to convince that personality to let go of the reins and allow the soul to utilize the personality as a function of service in the outer world, because the soul needs a healthy threefold personality as its outer servant, its outer garment. But the personality has been running the show for a long time. So what happens after the awakening is that you start to awaken to a higher prompting. You start to feel something deeper and more true than just your intellect and your emotions. You start to sense more of the soul's nature. That's great. That's great. And then you start to get more serious about it and think, I think that maybe I need to put more time into this to really develop this part of me, this higher part of me I'm sensing. So you might decide to learn to meditate, or you might decide to really commit yourself to regular service work on behalf of helping others, or you might really dive into studying deeper spiritual things than you had in the past. And so you're getting much more focused on your own development. Well, the lower self jumps in. The personality jumps in and says, not so fast, buddy. The personality says, I've been running the show for many, many lifetimes. And now, just because you hear a little faint voice, you think I'm going to let go of the reins? Forget it, says the personality, and a battle begins. It's a battle between your higher nature and your lower nature. It's it's a battle between knowledge and wisdom. It's a battle between lofty love and personality desire. It's a battle between the future and the past. Or as Kyle Gibran would say in The Prophet, you discover the God within you and the pygmy in the mist. The pygmy in the mist. So conflict, friends, conflict and crisis is actually part of it. It's only in this kingdom where evolution has the duality of identity, that is the struggle. And when we talk about soul personality fusion, we're trying to infuse more of the soul into personality, and that's the antidote to the problem of the tension between the two. The more fusion there is, the less conflict there is between the higher and lower part of us. So I'm speaking of it as an individual, but the same is true collectively. The soul of humanity is trying to impress itself into the personality of humanity. And unfortunately, and this is predicted, that what happens is when greater light is being shined upon humanity, shadow issues, I'm using a Jungian term here, shadow issues are dislodged and come to the surface in opposition. So that's why I think in the last few years we've seen the worst of governments, we've seen the worst of business, we certainly have seen the worst of religion. And I honestly think that if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably have seen the worst of ourselves. Um, there's something funny about it. The more higher consciousness is trying to impinge upon us, the more lower tendencies become exposed. And the truth is that so many of those lower tendencies have been with us for a long time, but nowhere near as visible as they are today. And you can't change anything unless you can see it. So in a certain sense, the crises is a good thing because we can't change anything unless we can see it. So that's a fact. Now, what's so interesting about this time frame is that so much of this is in preparation for humanity taking the first initiation. The first initiation is called the birth of the Christ within the heart. It has other names too, but that's the main name. And in many ways, the burning ground period we're experiencing now, collectively, globally, is going to have relationship to the requirements, you might say, that pertain to the first initiation. So the first initiation for humanity is similar to how it would look for an individual. For instance, there's always two things about the first initiation that are so central. The first is that the first initiation opens the heart wide. After all, it's called the birth of the Christ within the heart. Naturally, that's going to have a lot to do with bringing more of the quality of Christ through your heart. Literally, your heart chakra opens wide, and the Christ has another outlet to express through. So the quality of love becomes much more operative. And with that comes the greater capacity to sense humanity's oneness, because it's love that is the underlying energy that makes that possible. Love is hierarchical, friends, and it's related to the law of attraction. And um, you're starting to wake up to a higher quality of love, really seriously at the first initiation. And um, it represents a recognition of the underlying unity of all things, the underlying unity of all things. And from that comes a desire to serve. And that desire to serve is related to the notion that, how to put this, I'm going to try to paraphrase something the Tibetan said. He said that the first degree initiate, quote, assumes the burden of the future, unquote, meaning the first degree initiate really starts to dedicate their lives to making a contribution to a better world. And they often think about it in terms of longer periods of time. They think about it in a multi-generational, multi-incarnational perspective. So the point is that the first initiation has much to do with love. And but the other aspect of the first initiation is really, really apparent and a crisis in the world today. When an individual takes the first initiation, it also means that the soul has taken dominion over the appetites of the physical body. No longer do the physical body and its appetites have undue sway. It doesn't mean that a first degree initiate no longer has a need for food, doesn't mean that an initiate no longer has a sexual life. But what it does mean is that those natural appetites of the form are there and even honored, but that's a higher part of you that is able to hold itself and hold regulatory oversight over those appetites so that the appetites are not driving the life. An inner part of you still drives the life and has regulatory oversight over it. And the first initiation has to do with your physical relationship to life and how you interface in the outer world. How efficient are you in your use of time and energy and resources? All of that is first initiation. Not surprising that the seventh ray rules the first initiation because the seventh ray rules anything that has to do with the physical plane, the seventh plane, you see. So now translate that to the larger picture of humanity. I said earlier that deep inside, humanity is trying to figure out how to be one. And a lot of fears are rising up in opposition to that, even wars. But also, humanity has a real appetite problem, huge problem, because consumption is one of the greatest obstacles to the future, friends. I was a few years ago, I got an opportunity to go to Findhorn in Scotland, and I was one of their guest speakers. And Findhorn is a alternative society that was actually rooted in the Alice Bailey writings initially, and they've done amazing work. But when I was there, they had a lot of it was being shifted to focusing on environmental issues and how to reduce the footprint that humanity is placing on Mother Earth. And they did some calculations, and it's been determined that if humanity continues at its rate of consumption today, it would take 4 Earths to meet that demand. Think about that. 4 Earths. So consumption is rampant and out of line. And it's all based upon a confusion between want and need. And indeed, Western cultures, their economic systems are fueled by desire. You know, just watch advertising. They create a need where there really isn't any. And so our whole economic system is based upon amplifying desire for acquisition. And that's one of the things that's working against us. So all of this is part of the test. All of this is going to be related to the burning ground that we're walking across. Very interestingly, there's another sign of the zodiac that is also in the game here, a couple signs that are very strong in addition to Aquarius, of course. And one of them is the sign of Libra. Libra is a sign that has a lot to do, it's the scales, and it has a lot to do with the search for relationship, but more importantly, the search for right relationship, the right relationship. And on a personal level, that would be it goes beyond just interpersonal relationship. It can be what's the right relationship to have with one's career? What's the right relationship to have with money? What's the right relationship to have with my interests? Whatever. So in a way, everything has that potential. There's you and what you're perceiving, and that's a relationship. And Libra is always trying to figure out how to rightly fit in right relationship with that thing. Well, now if we go back to the idea that humanity is struggling to figure out how to be one, well, think about the question of right relationship. You see, I don't think that we can really find our oneness unless we really incorporate Libran ideas of right relationship. What's the right relationship between nation and nation? What's the right relationship between a government and those it governs? What's the right relationship between humanity and Mother Nature? What's the right relationship between humanity and money? What's the right relationship between men and women, religion and religion? These are hugely important questions, friends, and they are really right at the root of what a big part of the challenges that we now face. It's not surprising that so much of the crisis in the world today has to do with wrong relationship around money and resources and distribution and all of that. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the third ray ashram has a big role to play in it because it governs business enterprise. And yet its higher mandate is to create right distribution of resources to ensure the sustenance of all life on this planet. So if you think about this, let's look at this question of Libra and right relationship. Oh, and by the way, the Tibetan tells us that the sign of Libra will become increasingly important as humanity enters the 21st century. Well, here we are. Here we are. Because we can't take the first initiation unless the principle of right relationship is far more effectively woven into the fabric of our collective consciousness. But here's the thing. If we use an example of one of the crises is the environmental crisis. Now, if we use that as an example, you go back 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, very few people were talking about protecting the environment. 70 years ago, hardly anybody was aware of it. But now look at what's happening. So what's in terms of awareness? So what we're saying here is that each of us, each one of you, have some measure of alignment with your own soul, have some capacity to register the impressions, the intuitive impressions coming from the soul or the ashram beyond. But you're also able to receive impressions from the soul of humanity. In a way, your soul is an agent on behalf of the soul of humanity. And in this time period, the soul of humanity is trying to impress through its network, you might say, a set of higher values. And one of those values has to do with right relationship with Mother Nature. So what happens is more and more advanced disciples have been coming into incarnation. Many of you would probably fit into that category. And because you have some measure of alignment with your own soul, you have some measure of capacity to sense what constitutes right relationship. So when you start to sense what constitutes right relationship, because you're on the path and you have that capacity, then you simultaneously are more alert to where there's wrong relationship. In other words, to really sense wrong relationship, you have to have a real sense of what it means to find right relationship. So when we learn right relationship, we're also more able to recognize wrong relationship. And that is why the environmental movement has really surged over the last several years, because more and more disciples are awakening to the soul of humanity's urge for right relationship. And the um, the crisis then emerges, and that's part of the burning ground. So, in other words, it's in the discovery of wrong relationship that we begin the burning ground period, where we're all now walking across hot coals that we didn't know were there until we understood that we have wrong relationship with Mother Nature. But the good news about all of that is that out of that burning ground period comes the antidote. And the antidote is the rise of the environmental movement. So out of the pain of realizing wrong relationship, you have the organizing energies of people who are feel inwardly called to do something about it. And so they really, really begin to focus on that. And I'm just using the environmental crisis as one of many examples, actually. But it's so important to understand this, that we have to find right relationship in all things, in all things. Now, another thing to keep in mind when we think about this period, it's we're approaching, as I say, that we're in the burning ground in preparation for the first initiation, which could conceivably happen in the next couple, 3 decades. It's possible. It may not, because what's going on in the world today, particularly in the United States here, it's like talk about energies that can really pull us backwards. Because what's pulling us backwards now are attitudes of separateness, isolation. You know, the Tibetan says that one of the greatest obstacles to humanity's future is what he called, quote, the heresy of separateness. And the heresy of separateness is an energy that's rising strong, particularly in this country at the moment. Um, so one of the things to keep in mind is there's something called the new group of world servers that many of you are familiar with. And in fact, I have a graphic I'd like to show you about that. So as you can see, the this graphic here is sort of showing you a model of the whole system. So up here we have the hierarchy of masters and the seven ashrams, and then we have humanity here, and these are groupings of humanity that the Tibetan makes for us. And the new group of world servers become the interface between the hierarchy of masters, the ashrams, and humanity as a whole. The new group of world servers are the middle principle between the hierarchy and humanity. Its goal is to recognize intuitive impressions coming from the hierarchy and then translating those intuitive impressions into formulated ideas and then bringing them into the world as a function of transforming others. Now, now what's interesting about it is the new group of world servers, there's a few definitions we can give to it. Um, my way of defining it is it represents the sum total of all people on the planet today who have some measure of awakening to their own higher consciousness, who are also recognizing that they want to live more from that higher place. And as a result, they realize they got to work on their lower self so that it's transformed to be more receptive to the higher self. And in that process, they're gaining an increased urge to serve. Remember that the soul is governed by many laws, and the third law is called the law of service. Every soul wants to work through the personality. It wants to do it without the personality getting in the way. And in so doing, it wants to make an uplifting contribution to the betterment of something beyond itself. And that's service. So the new group of world servers they're dedicating their lives to service in some way. And I would imagine most, if not all of you listening to this broadcast are part of the new group. Most people don't even know they're part of it because it's an inner group, not an outer group. But the new group of world servers is interesting because from the master's perspective, they see it even a little differently. We believe that there's probably millions of members of the new group of world servers now in the world, most of them working behind the scenes. Um, and that the masters don't see a million disciples out there. They see one entity, and they call it the world disciple, the world disciple. And the catch is that we are told that much of the humanity's transition and the capacity for humanity to take the first initiation rests on the shoulders of the new group of world servers. So I realize I probably put a heavy weight on you right now, but it's true that it's the people who have had some awakening to their own soul that are the people that are most needed to make that difference in the world, that difference in the world. So the New World servers, we were told in 1945, from 1945 to 2025, right now, that's called the stage or the era of the forerunner. And it's said to be a testing time. where disciples have been tested to see if they can rise to the occasion. But think about it, friends. 2025 is now. It represents the acme point of the group. And so it's really now where we have to shine and show ourselves. Also in 2025 is when the conclave is occurring. Now, some of you probably are aware of the conclave, but just for those of you who may not, let me just say this. We are given to understand by the Tibetan that on the 25th year of every century, the masters of wisdom, including the Christ, including the lords of karma, and including Sanat Kumara, meet in conclave to make decisions that help support humanity and the other kingdoms of nature for the next 100 years. So they're meeting now. And I assure you, it's not in a Hilton hotel. It's actually deep inside, and it's a merging of sparks of life, mastered life, coming together to create energetic solutions. And in many ways, what we have done as members of the new group of world servers and our commitment to that service, in many ways, what we have done will have a bearing on the decisions that the masters make. So this is a really, really important time. In fact, I think what I'll do is I'll show you the quote that is the pivotal quote. There's several quotes about these conclaves, and actually I'm going to be doing a whole weekend retreat in two places in the United States with this, once in Seattle and once in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and that'll be in the autumn. But I created a whole thing about referencing previous um, the outcome or what happened as a result of the previous conclaves, all the way back to 1425. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example, 1825, the results of the 1825 conclave years later, as it precipitates down, led to the rise of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and England, and it led to the rise in the in labor movements around the world. So anyway, it's really interesting. The Tibetan gives you bits and pieces of how it has affected the past in our history. Um, so let me show you the quote that really brings it forward for us so that you're aware of it. Let me put it up here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just read this. First stage in the externalization of the hierarchy. He says, thus a great and new movement is proceeding, and a tremendously increased interplay and interaction is taking place. This will go on until AD 2025. During the years intervening between now and then, very great changes will be seen taking place. And at the great General Assembly of the hierarchy, held as usual every century, in 2025, the date in all probability will be set for the first stage of the externalization of the hierarchy. The present cycle, from now till that date, is called technically the stage of the forerunner. It is preparatory in nature, testing in its methods, and intended to be revelatory in its techniques and results. You can see, therefore, that the Chohans, masters, initiates, world disciples, and aspirants affiliated with the hierarchy are all at this time passing through a cycle of great activity. Well, here we are. I remember when I was brand new to this philosophy 40 some years ago, and I was reading this. I thought, oh my God, geez, that's amazing. It's a long way away. I wonder if I'll be alive. Well, apparently I still am, and you are, and we are, and this is huge. I mean, what an amazing time to be living. Incredible, incredible. And so, friends, this is the time when we have to bring the best of us forward. We have to bring the best of us forward. The truth is that the content of your causal body, which is the content of acquired wisdom, wisdom that you have earned through the crucible of countless incarnations and is stored in your causal body as wise faculty, that wisdom is a treasure to the ashram. In fact, sometimes the causal body is called the treasury. And your love, because the causal body is also the agency of Christ-like love. It's got two fundamental roles. It naturally has the love energy in it, in the substance of it, but the wisdom has to be earned, and you earn it over many, many incarnations. But but all of you have tremendous amounts of wisdom stored in your causal body, and you have the capacity to bring more Christ-like love into the world. And the truth, friends, is you are needed more now than at any time in your life or even in recent history. You are needed more now. Your love and your wisdom can make a difference. This is a year where we want to dedicate ourselves, really renew the sense of, I want to be part of the solution. I want to help in my way with the best I have to make a contribution to a more unity in the world and help humanity move to that first initiation. And so, as I say that to all of you, let me just say this as well, is that sometimes we're all kind of looking for our soul's purpose and just realize that your soul evaluates your spiritual work using a different measure than your personality uses to evaluate its spiritual work. See, the personality uses quantitative measures to determine how well it's doing spiritually, whereas the soul uses qualitative measures. The personality says how much, how big, how often, how frequent. In other words, it sees it as a accumulation process. How many people can I reach? That sort of thing, as an example. But that's not how the soul works. The soul doesn't use quantitative measures, it uses qualitative measures. Qualities like how well does its wisdom and its love effectively express through the lower self. So my point is that the soul in you is not about bigness or littleness. It's just isness. It's as if where you find your work, where your soul's effort should be, is not in the attitude of, well, once I get some big thing going on in another country or something, then I'll feel ready. No, it's right in the immediacy of your life. That's your Dharma. That's the place. And so you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to accumulate a certain number of people. You don't have to think in those terms at all. It just simply means bring your best forward in the circumstances of your life with a commitment to uplift, but don't worry about the quantity of upliftment. Just bring forth that upliftment because you are needed now more than ever before. This is your time. This is your chance. Um, there's so many things that can make us better at it. For instance, one of the things I always like to tell people is be sure that when you are thinking about making a difference out there, make sure your spiritual work is adjusted to your capacity and not the overwhelming need. A lot of times people, they see the world is so messed up that it feels like an overwhelming need, and sometimes they just dive in fully and burn out, where know your limits, know what you're able to do and what you're not able to do.
Mm.
Um, Another thing that is just, I'll give you some techniques that are said to be helpful. It's also important to cultivate what is sometimes called the quality of divine indifference. I know this is a weird word, divine indifference, because, you know, um, the word indifference, usually we have negative connotations with it. We might say, for instance, we might think the word indifference means I don't care, or indifferent meaning I hold a kind of elevated elitist attitude. Um, but no, we're talking about a different kind of indifference. The Tibetan says that the role of divine indifference is an essential quality that disciples must develop. What it means is it's an indifference to the pre the biases of your personality. It's an indifference not to other people, but to the pushes and pulls of your lower self that in the past might have won the day, but if you're indifferent to them, they lose their power. So that's kind of what we mean by the power of divine indifference. A couple other things that can help us as in terms of technique is, the Tibetan always talks about the 4 Ds. You probably remember it: be discriminative, decentralized, dispassionate, and detached, the 4 Ds. Discriminative meaning use your mind with a clear distinction and discrimination. No, 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 no recognize fine discernments with your mind. Decentralize. Take your eyes off yourself. Dispassion. Well, dispassion's interesting because dispassion, a lot of times people say, follow your passion. And here we're saying, follow your dispassion. What we're really saying is passion is related to your emotional body. We all have to figure out how do we use emotion and not be used by emotion. Emotion is so important to be effective as a tool in service, but we have to use it correctly. And so we want to recognize that we want to give a sense of how does it enrich an idea, and how much enrichment do you give it, how much feeling do you give it without distorting it? And so dispassion doesn't mean no feeling. It means measured feeling that creates emotional conviction about something you want to bring forward, but it also means that you're not distorting it because of that. Because you know how it is when you put too much feeling into something, into an idea, it can distort it. It can make a mountain out of a molehill. But if you don't have enough emotional passion, then it loses its oomph. It is it does emotions can add a kind of fuel to externalize something. How does the Tibetan say it? Something like when you add too much feeling to your progressive thought form, it drowns. But if you don't give it enough, it dies of thirst. And the 4th D is detached or detachment, meaning detach yourself from the need to see ready, quick results of your work, the fruits of your labor. Um, so those are some ideas. There's one thing I always tell people too is that this is a time when it's really good to discern the difference between the essential and the non-essential in your life. In your life. And also another thing that can help the new group of world servers is to develop a longer view of things, to see in longer cycles of time, because the soul and the personality, they relate to time differently. The personality only understands time in the context of a single life, because that's all it exists for just a single life. So it only has that as its measure, where the soul has the multi-incarnational view. So your work in the world, you've got to think about it. Don't think about it as just being this life. Think about it as being a series of incarnations, and that this life is just a piece that you're trying to accomplish and not the whole thing. Because you might find that, well, there are many, many things you're able to do now in service, many things you're doing now in service that may not bear fruit until the next incarnation. And I know when the personality hears that, it goes, ooh, I don't like that. But it's true. And yet the opposite has got to be considered too. In other words, many things that you're able to do now beautifully in service actually were cultivated in your previous life. So it goes both ways, friends. But nonetheless, it's important to think about how to relate to time and how to get into a relationship to time that is more effective for you. Other things that I can suggest to you is, you know, tend to see things in relativistic thinking. Um, you know, so long in the sixth ray age, in the sixth ray age, we had a period where we were focused on good and evil. See, one of the things about the sixth ray is that it's very devotional, but it tends to be black and white in its thinking. And the sixth ray often needs an enemy to highlight its goodness. So that's why in the sixth ray age and under the Christian dispensation, there was so much emphasis on the dark forces and evil and the devil and all of that, and Satan and hell and all of that. But that's because the sixth ray needs the enemy to highlight the good. In other words, you don't see the light until you can contrast it with the dark. And that was fine. It was said that that attitude 2,000 years ago was what facilitated the development of, quote, the nursery of human souls. But today, because of the seventh ray coming in, because the mind nature has developed so much more now, that it's not about that. It's about looking out at the world and recognizing that everything is a mixture of dark and light in differing proportions. Just like you and I. I have a soul, it's filled with light. I have a personality. Some of that personality is not yet redeemed. That's dark. I'm a mixture of dark and light. You are too. Every nation is, every social system is, every person is. If you weren't, you'd have another name. You'd have another name. You'd be called the master, the perfected master. So you start to think, with this work, you start to look at everything with that sense of where's the darkness and light? Where's the soul of this? And where's the personality of this thing that I'm looking at? And that takes the third eye to do that. Your third eye has many roles, but one of them is to help you see the soul hidden in other things. And so the more you're committing your life to spiritual service, the more you're able to use your third eye as a function of sensing the soul in the thing you serve. If you're a if you're a fifth ray soul and you're committing your life as a disciple to science, which is very common with fifth ray people, um, and if you're awake to your own soul nature, you're not just going to be working on whatever experiment or study you're doing in science, but you're also becoming more and more aware of the soul of science or the soul of the scientific institution that you might be working through, and then contrasting it with the personality. And always know that your role is to serve the soul of the other and much less the personality of the other. So as you can see, um, these are all ideas that you can consider. And, um, a few years ago, I'll tell you a quick little story about this idea of black and white. And it's really a story about how when we look out at the world, we've come to a place in this dawning age where we have to learn how to see everything as mixtures of darkness and light in differing proportions. And instead of saying, if I got two options here, one option is, oh, I think that's the good and this is the evil, this is right or this is wrong. No, that's too simplistic. And now it's what is the proportion of light and dark here versus the proportion of light and dark here. And in that, we can have a relative weighing of these things and make much sounder decisions. But the sixth ray has got this absolutist quality where they're not comfortable with gray, you might say. And yet evolution is all about evolving through gray and gradually lightening the tint of that gray over time. So it's a big subject, but the point is that we have to get into the world. Another highlighting feature of this is um, in the sixth ray age, uh, that was the nursery period for the human soul, and it led many religions, particularly Christianity, but even in Buddhism and so forth, it led to a rise of belief in a cloistered approach to uniting with God. So let's go into the convent, get protected by the convent walls. We get protected by the convent walls because we see the world, the flesh, and the devil, as they would say, as being the opposition. Let's get safe in here, and then we can establish contemplative rapport with God our whole lives. That had its place hundreds of years ago. But today, we're realizing that those social institutions that we thought were the world, the flesh, and the devil or just categories of human consciousness evolving over the vastness of time, whether it's science, the arts, culture, religion, education, government. All of those are categories of human consciousness evolving over time. Each has a higher nature, each has a lower nature. And when you're on the path of occultism, when you're getting more seventh ray into you, when you're a member of the new group of world servers, you're recognizing that and that you're inclined to serve by being attentive to the soul of the business you're in or the soul of the institution you service. So that those discernments are really important. I'll just close with a little sentence here, a story that kind of highlights this because I always think about this when I think about this black and white idea. And I've shared this story with some people in the past. Maybe some of you have heard me say this before. But many years ago, I was invited to do a talk at a church, an alternative church, actually, in Phoenix, Arizona. And there was a large group of people there, probably like 150 people. And I was one of a few speakers. And I was invited to speak for maybe about a half hour on some spiritual subject. And so I started the talk by saying, look, everybody, if you have any questions, hold them to the end. And if I have time, I'll open it up for questions. Okay, so off I go. And I begin to do this talk. Well, after about 5 minutes, there was a woman in the audience who jumped up and she was kind of in the back and she yelled at me. She says, I just want to know one thing from you. She said, do you believe in the Antichrist? I was shocked. I wasn't talking about that at all. Nothing even close to that. But I knew that I had a evangelical fundamentalist Christian in my midst. So what I did was I said to her, I paused and then I said, I actually do, is what I said. And then I said, I can even tell you who it is. And by the way, everybody got real quiet there. Everybody got quiet. And then I said, if you want to know who the Antichrist is, just look in the mirror. That's what I said. And then immediately after that, I said, and if you want to know who the Christ is, just look in the mirror. And you don't even have to move because you and I are a place where two forces meet. What is Christ anyway? Christ is the living energy of love, wisdom, and inclusivity. And what is Antichrist? It's any state of consciousness that is antithetical to that. So you don't have to go looking for the bad guy out there when it's fact it's our own darkness. So it's a story that just sort of highlights the very thing I'm talking about, the idea that we will be much more effective at this transition time if we, instead of judging, saying this is the evil and this is the good, it's more of what is the mixture of light and darkness here versus here. Um, we're gonna make sounder decisions. So, just last point. You're needed now. You are needed more than ever now. So I encourage you to, as a group, because you've got some important work to do in terms of developing your work around esoteric healing. That's fantastic. But also as an individual, this is your time, both as a group and as an individual. The ashram is watching. And I have no question in my mind that if all of us do our very best, individually and in group formation, the Christ will look well upon us and smile. On that note, I think I'll stop here.